Kawhi's dream return suddenly collapses. Kawhi Leonard thought the final chapter of his NBA career had already been written. He was going back to Toronto, the city where he became a champion, a finals MVP, and a permanent basketball legend. The deal was reportedly agreed upon. The players were selected. The draft picks were committed. Raptors fans were already imagining Kawhi walking back onto the court in the jersey that changed his life. Then everything stopped. Not because Kawhi changed his mind. Not because Toronto backed away. And not because the Clippers suddenly demanded a better offer. The Blockbuster trade was frozen by an investigation involving a bankrupt financial company, a massive endorsement agreement, and questions that could threaten Kawhi's contract itself. The proposed package was enormous. Toronto was reportedly prepared to send Brandon Ingram, Grady Dick, multiple first-round selections, a future pick swap, and additional draft compensation to Los Angeles. This was not simply a trade for another star. It was the Raptors placing their future on the table to bring home the man who delivered the greatest moment in franchise history. And on paper, Kawhi still looked worth the gamble. At 35 years old, he was coming off one of the strongest statistical seasons of his career, averaging nearly 28 points per game while playing 65 games. After years of injury questions, he had reminded the entire league that when healthy, he could still perform like one of basketball's most dangerous two-way superstars. More importantly, Kawhi reportedly wanted Toronto. He was not searching for the biggest market or the brightest spotlight. He appeared ready to return, sign an extension, and finish his career where he won the 2019 championship. But just as the reunion seemed complete, the NBA reportedly warned Toronto that completing the trade could expose the organization to devastating consequences. If investigators ruled that Kawhi's existing contract was connected to an illegal salary cap arrangement, that contract could potentially be voided. Toronto could lose its players, sacrifice its future draft picks, and still end up without Kawhi. So the Raptors did not cancel the deal. They paused it, and now Kawhi's emotional homecoming is trapped between basketball history, corporate collapse, and an investigation with no guaranteed ending. Where are you watching from today? Comment 1 if you believe Kawhi will eventually return to Toronto, or comment 2 if you think this deal is already doomed. Subscribe to the channel because the deeper we go into this investigation, the stranger this story becomes. The trade package that changed everything. The moment Toronto agreed to the deal, the message was unmistakable. The Raptors were no longer thinking cautiously. They were preparing to bet the next decade on one final championship window. Brandon Ingram was expected to headline the return for Los Angeles, giving the Clippers a proven scorer who could immediately become the centerpiece of a younger roster. Grady Dick represented the long-term upside, a developing shooter with the kind of offensive potential teams rarely surrender early in his career. Then came the draft capital, multiple first-round selections, a future pick swap, and additional compensation that could shape both franchises for years. Toronto was not simply acquiring Kawhi Leonard. It was surrendering flexibility, youth, and control over its future because the organization believed his return could transform everything. That belief was not based only on nostalgia. Kawhi had reportedly produced one of his strongest seasons in years. He looked healthier, sharper, and more efficient than many expected at this stage of his career. The injuries that had followed him for so long had not disappeared, but they no longer completely defined the conversation. For Toronto, the calculation was brutally simple. A healthy Kawhi could still change a playoff series by himself. He could defend elite wings, control the pace late in games, create efficient offense under pressure, and give the Raptors something almost impossible to manufacture a player opponents genuinely fear in the final minutes. But the emotional value was even greater. Kawhi was not just another superstar. He was the man connected to the greatest postseason run in franchise history. His return would have brought back memories of the shot against Philadelphia, the championship parade, and the belief that Toronto could stand above the entire NBA. The front office was reportedly already looking beyond the trade. The next step would have been a contract extension that could keep Kawhi in Toronto through the final major years of his career. The organization was not planning a short reunion, it was preparing an ending. Then the league's warning changed the equation. Suddenly, every player and draft pick Toronto was willing to sacrifice became part of a potential disaster. If Kawhi's contract was later challenged or voided, the Raptors could lose everything they had traded without receiving the long-term superstar they believed they were acquired. That was no longer a basketball risk. It was a franchise-level threat. The investigation behind the blocked reunion. To understand why the deal stopped, the story has to move far away from the basketball court. At the center of the controversy was aspiration. A financial company that promoted itself through environmental promises, celebrity partnerships, and enormous business agreements. The company had attracted major investors and high-profile relationships before eventually collapsing into bankruptcy. Steve Ballmer, the owner of the Clippers, had reportedly invested heavily in aspiration. The company also had a major commercial relationship with the Clippers and separately signed Kawhi Leonard to a lucrative endorsement agreement. None of those facts automatically prove wrongdoing. NBA stars regularly sign endorsement deals. Team owners invest in outside businesses. Companies pay athletes millions of dollars to represent their brands. The questions began because of how the relationships overlap. Investigators reportedly wanted to determine whether Aspiration's agreement with Kawhi was a legitimate marketing deal or whether it had been used as an indirect way to provide him with additional compensation beyond his NBA contract. That distinction could decide everything. Under league rules, teams cannot secretly provide players with outside payments designed to avoid salary cap restrictions. If an organization uses a business partner, sponsor, or connected company to deliver hidden compensation, the league can treat the arrangement as salary cap circumvention. The reported details made the situation even more suspicious. Kawhi's deal was said to include payments connected to promotional responsibilities that he may not have been required to perform. If investigators concluded that millions of dollars were paid without meaningful marketing obligations, the agreement could look less like a traditional endorsement and more like a hidden financial benefit. The Clippers strongly denied that interpretation. They maintained that they did not direct money to Kawhi through Aspiration and argued that the organization had been caught inside a much larger corporate fraud. That defense mattered because Aspiration's collapse was not merely a failed business story. One of the company's key figures became connected to serious legal problems, creating a complicated financial trail that investigators now had to reconstruct. Every contract, payment, email, meeting, and internal document could become important. The NBA reportedly brought in outside legal experts to examine the evidence, meaning this was no routine league review. And until those investigators determined whether the endorsement agreement was legitimate, Toronto could not safely complete the trade. A bankrupt company had suddenly gained the power to control Kawhi Leonard's basketball future. Why Kawhi's contract could be in danger? The most frightening possibility was not a fine against the Clippers. It was the possibility that Kawhi Leonard's NBA contract could be challenged. If investigators concluded that the Clippers had used an outside company to provide illegal compensation, the league could impose severe penalties. Draft picks could be taken away. The organization could face major financial punishment. Executives or team officials could be disciplined. But for Kawhi, the greatest danger was far more personal. His existing contract could potentially be voided. That outcome would create chaos across the league. Kawhi was still owed an enormous salary, and the proposed trade had been built around the assumption that Toronto would receive the rights attached to that contract. If the agreement disappeared after the trade was completed, the entire foundation of the deal could collapse. The Raptors would have already surrendered Brandon Ingram, Grady Dick, and valuable future assets. Los Angeles would have received its rebuilding package, yet Toronto might suddenly be left without the player it sacrificed everything to acquire. There was no simple protection against that scenario. The league reportedly informed Toronto that the organization would have to accept the risk connected to the investigation. That warning forced the Raptors to pause. It was not evidence that Toronto had lost confidence in Kawhi. It was evidence that the organization understood how destructive the worst possible outcome could be. Kawhi's own position was equally complicated. He had not been publicly found guilty of any wrongdoing. He was not accused of operating Aspiration or organizing the company's financial structure. He had reportedly cooperated with investigators and answered questions about the endorsement agreement. But league penalties do not always depend entirely on whether a player personally designed a questionable arrangement. If the payment itself was considered improper compensation, the consequences could still reach the contract connected to that player. That created an almost impossible situation. Kawhi could believe that he signed a legitimate endorsement agreement. The Clippers could insist that they never directed the payment. Aspiration's former leadership could carry responsibility for the company's collapse. Yet the final ruling could still damage Kawhi's career, destroy a major trade, and change two franchises. For a player already nearing the final stage of his career, the timing could not have been worse. He had earned the opportunity to choose his ending. Now lawyers, financial records, and league regulations were deciding whether that choice would survive. The Uncle Dennis connection returns. The investigation became even more uncomfortable when attention returned to Dennis Robertson, Kawhi Leonard's uncle and longtime business advisor. Robertson had been an influential figure throughout Kawhi's career, often appearing in the background of his most important professional decision. His name had already surfaced during Kawhi's previous relationship with Toronto, particularly during the 2019 free agency process. After winning the championship, Kawhi had the opportunity to remain with the Raptors. Toronto wanted to keep him, the fan base desperately wanted him back, and the organization was prepared to build around him. But according to previous reporting, Robertson allegedly raised questions about additional business opportunities connected to Kawhi's next contract. Those discussions reportedly included outside financial benefits that would not necessarily require traditional promotional work. Toronto's ownership took the concerns seriously enough to involve the league. The NBA reviewed the situation and did not punish the Raptors. Kawhi eventually left for Los Angeles. Years later, investigators were now examining an arrangement that appeared uncomfortably similar to the type of benefit reportedly discussed during the 2019 negotiations: significant outside money with limited public promotional obligation. That similarity did not prove that Robertson or Kawhi had violated league rules, but it created a powerful narrative investigators could not ignore. The Raptors had once been placed in a position where they needed to protect themselves from questionable financial expectations. They refused to cross the line, lost Kawhi, and watched him join the Clippers. Now the Clippers were facing scrutiny over whether an outside company had delivered exactly the kind of benefit Toronto had avoided. The irony was impossible to miss. Toronto had lost the superstar after choosing caution. Los Angeles had landed him and built an entire championship plan around him. Yet years later, Toronto was once again waiting for Kawhi, while the Clippers defended the financial circumstances surrounding his contract. Robertson and Kawhi were reportedly interviewed during the investigation, placing them directly inside the process. Every answer could influence whether investigators viewed the aspiration agreement as a normal endorsement or part of a hidden compensation structure. For Kawhi, this was no longer only about returning to Toronto. It was about whether decisions made years earlier by advisors, executives, investors, and business partners would follow him into the final chapter of his career. The past had returned at the worst possible moment, and this time it was powerful enough to stop an entire Blockbuster trade. Toronto's impossible decision. Raptors fans saw the pause as heartbreak. Toronto's front office had to see it as risk management. The organization reportedly remained committed to bringing Kawhi back, but commitment alone could not erase the financial danger. The Raptors had to evaluate the most catastrophic outcome, not simply the most exciting. Imagine the trade being completed before the investigation ended. Toronto would send away Brandon Ingram, removing one of its most productive offensive players. It would give up Grady Dick, sacrificing a young shooter whose development could become valuable over several seasons. It would surrender future draft picks and reduce its ability to rebuild if the Kawhi experiment failed. Then, weeks or months later, the NBA could rule that Kawhi's contract was connected to an illegal compensation arrangement. If that contract were voided, Toronto could lose the entire purpose of the trade. The Raptors would not only lose talent, they could lose direction. Their roster would be constructed around a superstar who was no longer guaranteed to remain under contract. Their future draft assets would belong to Los Angeles. Their ability to recover could be damaged for years. No responsible front office could ignore that possibility. The emotional pressure made the decision harder. Toronto had already experienced the greatest season in franchise history with Kawhi. Fans viewed his return as unfinished destiny. The organization knew that bringing him home would generate enormous excitement, ticket demand, media attention, and immediate championship expectations. But basketball executives cannot build teams through emotion alone. They have to survive the downside. That is why the pause mattered. Toronto was not abandoning Kawhi. It was refusing to accept an open-ended legal risk without knowing how severely the league might act. The Clippers reportedly wanted the Raptors to assume responsibility for any consequences attached to Kawhi's contract. Toronto could not agree without clarity. Both sides were trapped. Los Angeles wanted to move into a younger era. Toronto wanted to begin its reunion. Kawhi wanted security and control over his future. Yet none of them could complete the next step until the investigation reached a conclusion. Every day of delay created new problems. Toronto could not finalize its rotation. Los Angeles could not fully integrate the expected return package. Kawhi could not begin extension discussions. Players connected to the deal remained uncertain about where they would live, train, and compete. One unresolved investigation had frozen two organizations in the middle of transformation. Kawhi's last chance to control his ending. Kawhi Leonard has spent much of his career being defined by circumstances he could not fully control. In San Antonio, his relationship with the organization collapsed after disagreements surrounding his injury and recovery. He wanted to move toward Los Angeles, but the Spurs sent him to Toronto instead. At the time, Toronto was not his chosen destination. It became the place that changed his legacy. Kawhi delivered one of the most unforgettable playoff performances in modern NBA history. He controlled games with patience, strength, and precision. He carried the Raptors through exhausting series, hit one of the most dramatic shots the league had ever seen, and ultimately helped bring Canada its first NBA championship. Then he left. His decision to join the Clippers was supposed to give him everything Toronto could not: home, family proximity, organizational power, and the chance to compete in Los Angeles. The reality became far more complicated. Injuries repeatedly interrupted the Clippers' championship plans. Seasons ended without the deep playoff success the organization expected. Roster changes followed, teammates departed, and the window that once looked enormous slowly narrowed. Now, Kawhi had reportedly reached a different conclusion. Toronto was no longer the destination chosen for him. It was the destination he was choosing for himself. That difference gave the potential reunion emotional power. He was not returning as a temporary rental or an uncertain star waiting for free agency. He appeared ready to sign an extension and complete his career with the franchise where he achieved his greatest team success. For a 5-year-old player, that opportunity might never appear again. The NBA moves quickly. Injuries can change value within weeks. Front offices can shift direction after one disappointing season. Younger stars rise, salary structures tighten, and championship windows close without warning. Kawhi had reportedly produced the kind of season that restored his leverage. He was still scoring at an elite level, still defending with intelligence, and still capable of controlling important moments. This was the moment to secure his final major contract and decide how his career would end. Instead, he was forced to wait. Every week of investigation cost him time. Every delay pushed extension talks further away. Every unanswered question increased the possibility that the reunion could become too complicated to complete. Kawhi had already lost control of one major trade in his career. Now, just as he appeared ready to choose his own ending, control was being taken away again. The Clippers' defense and the league's dilemma. The Clippers did not respond like an organization preparing to accept guilt. They publicly denied using aspiration to provide hidden compensation to Kawhi Leonard and insisted that the team had cooperated fully with the NBA's investigation. According to their position, the franchise had turned over extensive records, participated in interviews, and opened its internal operations to outside investigators. The Clippers presented themselves not as architects of a salary cap scheme, but as victims of a company connected to fraud and financial collapse. That defense created a serious challenge for the NBA. The league had to determine intent. Did Steve Ballmer's investment and aspiration create an indirect pathway for money to reach Kawhi? Did Clippers officials influence the endorsement agreement? Was the company acting independently when it signed the deal? Did Kawhi perform enough legitimate promotional work to justify the compensation? And who understood the full structure at the moment the contracts were created? The answers could not be based only on appearances. A large investment, a team sponsorship, and an athlete endorsement may look suspicious when placed together, but the NBA still needed evidence connecting those relationships to a deliberate effort to avoid salary cap rule. The league also had to protect its own credibility. If it moved too slowly, fans and teams would accuse it of allowing uncertainty to damage players and franchises. If it rushed the process, it could impose historic punishment without fully understanding a complicated corporate fraud. Commissioner Adam Silver reportedly acknowledged that the investigation could not continue forever, while also emphasizing that accuracy mattered more than speed. That balance sounded reasonable. For everyone trapped inside the trade, it offered little comfort. The Clippers wanted to begin a post-Kawhi era. Toronto wanted to prepare for his return. Kawhi wanted a new contract. Ingram and Dick needed clarity about their futures, yet the league could not simply approve the deal and hope the problem disappeared. If investigators later uncovered proof of illegal compensation, the NBA would face an even larger crisis. Other teams would demand severe punishment. The players' union could challenge the consequences. The league's salary cap system would appear vulnerable to wealthy owners using outside companies to deliver hidden benefits. This was bigger than one trade. The ruling could establish how aggressively the NBA responds when team ownership, private investment, sponsorship money, and player compensation overlap. Kawhi's future had become the test case, a trade frozen between hope and disaster. Despite the uncertainty, the deal was not described as dead. That distinction mattered. The Raptors reportedly remained interested in completing the trade once the investigation ended. The Clippers continued to prepare for a younger roster built around the expected return. League insiders still believe the transaction could eventually move forward, but a paused trade is not harmless. Every delay changes the environment around it. Toronto cannot fully commit to a roster built around Kawhi while he technically remains under contract with Los Angeles. Coaches cannot confidently design rotations. Executives cannot make secondary trades without knowing which players will remain. The organization's entire strategy sits between two possible futures. In one future, Kawhi returns, signs an extension, and gives the Raptors another opportunity to compete deep into the playoffs. His experience changes the locker room. His presence raises expectations. Toronto becomes one of the league's most fascinating teams overnight. In the other future, the investigation produces serious penalties. Kawhi's contract becomes unstable. The trade collapses or requires major renegotiation. Toronto loses months of planning and may have to rebuild its strategy after other opportunities have disappeared. Los Angeles faces the same uncertainty from the opposite direction. The Clippers are prepared to receive Ingram, Dick, and valuable draft assets. That package could give them immediate scoring, long-term development, and the flexibility to build a new identity. But until the trade becomes official, none of those pieces belong to them. The players themselves are caught in the middle. Ingram and Dick may know that their current team has already agreed to move them. Kawhi may know that Los Angeles is ready to begin without him. Yet all three must remain professionally connected to organizations that have already planned their departures. That emotional tension is rarely discussed. Trades are often described through contracts and assets, but they involve people whose lives can change overnight. Families relocate. Training plans shift. Relationships with coaches and teammates become uncertain. Here, the uncertainty has continued far beyond a normal negotiation. The greatest fear is that time itself could destroy the reunion, even if the investigation eventually clears the path. Injuries, roster changes, financial decisions, or shifting priorities could alter what both teams are willing to accept. The deal remains alive, but every day it stays frozen. The distance between hope and disaster becomes smaller. What this saga means for Kawhi, Toronto, and the NBA. The final outcome of this story will matter far beyond one player and one trade. For Toronto, the lesson is about discipline. The Raptors clearly want Kawhi Leonard back, but championship ambition cannot erase financial reality. A smart organization must understand the difference between taking a basketball risk and accepting a legal disaster. Trading young talent and future draft picks for an aging superstar is already dangerous. Doing it while his contract may be affected by an unresolved investigation could threaten the franchise for years. For the Clippers, the situation is a warning about how closely ownership, sponsorships, investments, and player compensation must be separated. Even when every agreement appears legal on paper, overlapping financial relationships can create suspicion strong enough to damage a team's reputation and freeze its future. Transparency is no longer optional when hundreds of millions of dollars are moving between powerful organizations. For the NBA, the challenge is even greater. The league must protect competitive fairness without destroying careers through assumptions. If there was deliberate salary cap circumvention, the punishment must be serious enough to prevent richer teams from creating hidden advantages. But if the evidence does not prove wrongdoing, the league must avoid turning suspicion into a verdict. And then there is Kawhi. His career has always been surrounded by silence, injuries, questions, and decisions made behind closed doors. Yet his basketball legacy remains undeniable. He won championships with 2 franchises, delivered historic playoff performances, and became one of the most complete two-way players of his generation. Now, he is not fighting an opponent on the court, he is fighting time. The most humane solution is not to search for a villain before the facts are complete. It is to demand fairness for every person involved, the teams, the players being traded, the fans waiting for answers, and Kawhi himself. Careers are short. Decisions made in offices can affect families, reputations, and years of work. Toronto should remain patient, the Clippers should continue cooperating, the NBA should move carefully but decisively, and Kawhi should be given the opportunity to finish his career based on what he still brings to the game, not only on the financial controversy surrounding him, because the best ending is not revenge, scandal, or destruction. It is clarity. Do you believe Kawhi will finally return to Toronto? Comment 1 if the reunion will happen, or comment 2 if this investigation will end the deal. Like the video, share it with another NBA fan, and subscribe to the channel for the next major update.